A dead rat is one of the most unremarkable things in the world. It is the kind of thing a person sees, grimaces at, and disposes of without a second thought, especially in the grimy, vermin-infested boiler rooms of wartime factories. Which is precisely why, during the war, Allied intelligence saw in the humble dead rat one of the most ingenious weapons of sabotage ever devised. They understood a simple truth about human psychology, that the things we find most disgusting are the things we are least likely to examine closely. And so they took the dead rat, that object of universal revulsion, and turned it into a bomb. This is the story of one of the strangest and most clever sabotage weapons of the entire war, and the brilliant thinking about human nature that made it possible. This is a story about ingenuity, about the unconventional thinking that turned ordinary objects into instruments of war, and about the clever minds who understood that sabotage was as much about psychology as it was about explosives. It is a story about how creativity and an understanding of human behavior could produce weapons far more sophisticated, in their way, than mere firepower. And it is a story about the hidden, secret side of the war, the shadow conflict of saboteurs and special operatives who fought not with armies, but with cunning and imagination. To understand the exploding rat, you first have to understand the world of sabotage in which it was conceived. During the war, alongside the great battles fought by massive armies, there was another kind of warfare being waged in the shadows. This was the war of sabotage, of special operations, of secret agents working behind enemy lines to disrupt, damage, and undermine the enemy's war effort. Organizations were established specifically to wage this kind of unconventional warfare, to develop the tools and techniques that secret agents and resistance fighters could use to strike at the enemy from within. These organizations became hotbeds of ingenuity, of creative thinking about how to do damage through means other than conventional military force. The challenge facing those who waged this shadow war was a difficult one. Saboteurs and resistance fighters could not confront the enemy directly. They operated in secret, behind enemy lines, surrounded by enemy forces. They needed ways to do damage that could be carried out covertly, that could deceive the enemy, that could strike at vulnerable points without exposing the saboteur to immediate detection. This required not just explosives and weapons, but cleverness, deception, and an understanding of how to exploit the enemy's habits and assumptions. The best sabotage was not just destructive, but cunning, using the enemy's own expectations against them. It was within this context of creative, unconventional thinking that the idea of the exploding rat was born. The concept was brilliantly simple and yet deeply clever. The idea was to take the carcass of a dead rat, fill it with explosives, and disguise it so that it appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary dead rat. This explosive-filled rat could then be planted in a strategic location where it would be likely to be disposed of in a way that would trigger the explosion. The genius of the concept lay in its exploitation of human psychology and the predictable ways that people would react to finding a dead rat. Now, we should be honest about the history here, because the exploding rats are a real and documented part of the history of wartime sabotage, and the story deserves to be told with accuracy. What follows is grounded in the genuine record of these unconventional weapons, though we will tell it as a narrative to convey its full ingenuity. The core is true. Allied intelligence really did develop explosive devices disguised as dead rats, intended for use in sabotage operations against the enemy. The concept, the thinking behind it, and its intended use are all part of the documented history of the creative and unconventional warfare waged in the shadows of the larger conflict. The intended use of the exploding rats reveals the cleverness of the concept. The plan was to plant these explosive-filled rats near boilers or furnaces in factories and other industrial facilities. The thinking was based on a clever prediction of human behavior. When a worker discovered a dead rat lying near a boiler, the natural and most likely response would be to dispose of it quickly and with minimal fuss. And the most convenient way to dispose of a dead rat in a boiler room would be to simply shovel it into the furnace, to burn it up and be rid of the disgusting thing. This was exactly the reaction the saboteurs were counting on. The brilliance of this plan lay in its exploitation of a predictable human reaction. The saboteurs understood that people, confronted with a dead rat, would not examine it closely. They would not suspect that it might be anything other than what it appeared to be. The very disgust that a dead rat inspires would work in the saboteur's favor, ensuring that the worker would handle it quickly and carelessly, eager to be rid of it. And by disposing of it in the furnace, the worker would unwittingly trigger the explosion as the heat detonated the explosives hidden within the rat's carcass. The result would be an explosion in the boiler, potentially causing significant damage to critical industrial equipment. Consider the cleverness of this approach. The saboteurs did not need to plant a bomb in an obvious way, risking detection. They did not need to gain access to the furnace itself or to handle dangerous explosives in plain sight. They simply needed to place a dead rat, the most innocuous and unremarkable of objects, in a location where it would be found and disposed of in the desired manner. The enemy's own workers, acting on the most natural of impulses, would do the rest, unwittingly destroying their own equipment. It was sabotage by deception, using human psychology as the trigger. The choice of boilers and furnaces as targets was also clever. These were critical pieces of industrial equipment essential to the functioning of factories and other facilities. An explosion in a boiler could cause significant damage, disrupting production and potentially taking a facility out of operation. By targeting this critical equipment, the exploding rats could strike at the enemy's industrial capacity, the engine of their war effort. And the nature of boiler explosions meant that even beyond the immediate damage, there might be confusion about the cause, with the explosion potentially being attributed to mechanical failure rather than sabotage. There is something almost playfully ingenious about the entire concept, a kind of dark cleverness that reflects the creative thinking of those who waged the shadow war. The idea of turning a dead rat into a weapon, of using the enemy's own disgust and predictable behavior against them, represents a kind of lateral thinking that goes far beyond conventional approaches to warfare. It is the product of minds that were willing to think unconventionally, to look at ordinary objects and see in them potential weapons, to understand that warfare could be waged through cunning and deception as well as through force. The exploding rat also illustrates a broader principle of sabotage and unconventional warfare, the principle of exploiting the enemy's assumptions and habits. The most effective sabotage often works not by overcoming the enemy's defenses directly, but by exploiting the gaps in their attention, the predictable patterns of their behavior, the assumptions they make without thinking. The enemy did not expect a dead rat to be a bomb, and that very lack of suspicion was what made the weapon potentially effective. By understanding and exploiting the enemy's assumptions, the saboteurs could strike at them in ways they would never anticipate. It is worth reflecting on the kind of mind that could conceive of such a weapon. It required not just technical knowledge of explosives, but a deep understanding of human psychology, an appreciation for how people behave, what they assume, how they react to certain situations. The designers of the exploding rat were, in a sense, students of human nature, using their insight into human behavior to design a weapon that would exploit predictable reactions. This combination of technical skill and psychological insight is characteristic of the best unconventional warfare, which relies as much on understanding the enemy's mind as on the tools of destruction. The story of the exploding rats also reveals the hidden dimensions of the war, the secret operations and unconventional weapons that existed alongside the great battles. When we think of the war, we tend to think of massive armies, of tanks and planes and ships, of the clash of vast forces. But there was also this other war, the shadow war of saboteurs and secret agents, of clever devices and covert operations. This hidden war was waged with ingenuity and cunning, with weapons like the exploding rat that relied on creativity rather than firepower. It is a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of the larger conflict. There is a lesson here, too, about the power of unconventional thinking. The exploding rat was the product of minds willing to think outside the conventional bounds of warfare, to consider possibilities that more conventional thinkers might have dismissed. This willingness to think creatively, to consider unusual approaches, to see potential in the most unlikely of places, was a valuable asset in the shadow war. It reminds us that creativity and unconventional thinking can be powerful tools, capable of producing solutions and approaches that conventional thinking would never generate. The ability to look at a dead rat and see a weapon is the kind of creative leap that can change the nature of a conflict. Consider, as well, the psychological dimension of a weapon like the exploding rat. Beyond the physical damage it could cause, there was a psychological effect to the knowledge that even a dead rat might be a bomb. Once the enemy became aware that such weapons existed, Every dead rat became a potential threat, every innocuous object a possible danger. This kind of uncertainty, this need to be suspicious even of the most ordinary things, could create a climate of anxiety and caution that was itself a kind of victory for the saboteurs. The weapon worked not just through the explosions it caused, but through the suspicion and uncertainty it created. The development of weapons like the exploding rat reflects the broader ingenuity that characterized the Shadow War. Throughout the conflict, those who waged unconventional warfare developed an astonishing array of clever devices and techniques, from hidden weapons to disguised explosives to ingenious tools for sabotage and espionage. The exploding rat was just one example of this creativity, one instance of the unconventional thinking that produced a whole arsenal of secret weapons and devices. Together, these innovations represented a remarkable flowering of creativity in the service of war, a testament to human ingenuity even in the darkest of times. It is also worth appreciating the boldness of actually deploying such a weapon. It is one thing to conceive of an exploding rat and another to actually manufacture these devices and plant them in enemy facilities. This required not just the cleverness to design the weapon, but the courage and skill to deploy it, to smuggle these devices into enemy territory and place them where they would be effective. The saboteurs and agents who carried out these operations took enormous risks, operating behind enemy lines, using these unconventional weapons in the face of grave danger. Their courage was as essential as the cleverness of the weapons they employed. By the end of the war, the exploding rats had taken their place among the many ingenious devices that characterized the Shadow War, a memorable example of the creativity and unconventional thinking that defined this hidden side of the conflict. The concept, with its clever exploitation of human psychology, stands as a testament to the ingenuity of those who waged war in the shadows, who understood that sabotage was as much about cunning and deception as about explosives and force. It remains one of the most fascinating and memorable examples of the unconventional weapons developed during the war. So remember the exploding rats, those most unlikely of weapons, dead rats filled with explosives and planted in enemy boiler rooms. Remember the cleverness of the concept, the brilliant exploitation of human psychology, the understanding that a worker confronted with a dead rat would shovel it into the furnace and unwittingly trigger an explosion. Remember the ingenuity of the minds that conceived such a weapon, combining technical skill with deep insight into human behavior. And remember what this strange weapon reveals about the hidden side of the war, the shadow conflict of saboteurs and secret agents waged not with armies, but with cunning, creativity, and an understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not force, but the clever exploitation of the enemy's own predictable nature.